for taking time out of your busy days to listen to my presentation, which is based on my dissertation research. I study hydropower on the Colorado River, and I particularly focus on how institutions, that's the laws and policies that govern dams, have created conflicts, as well as the consequences of changing dam operations. The Colorado River is one of the most iconic rivers in the world. It covers 2 countries, you can follow my mouse, and it covers 7 states in the US and parts of Mexico. This river is managed by a complex set of laws, policies, interstate compacts, Supreme Court decrees, and international treaties that make for a very, very complicated and large body of law. This framework of law and policy has allocated every drop of this river, and it serves multiple purposes. Particularly, it serves critical water needs for 40 million people, that's 1 in 10 Americans, almost 4.5 million acres of farmland in the United States as well as Mexico, as well as several species of endangered flora and fauna and power production. But this iconic river is going dry. Beginning in the 1990s and the 2000s, this river entered one of the worst droughts in 1,200 years of record keeping. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are the largest water storage reservoirs on this river. They hold 85% of the river's storage capacity and hold almost 4 years worth of water supply for the 40 million people that depend on this river. Beginning of the drought, you could see that the combined capacity of the 2 reservoirs was almost 92%. They were almost full. But because of the drought, they're barely 50% full today. As of last week, Lake Mead was just 56% full, and Lake Powell was only 39% full. If you visit the dams, you'll see that declining water levels have formed bathtub rings around the reservoirs, which show where the water used to be versus where the level is today. Managing the river for meeting the multiple and oftentimes competing uses for cities, agriculture, endangered species, and power production is a challenging task. And this task has been made worse by the drought. When you think about it, the drought itself isn't the most interesting facet of what's happening to the river, but the drought has created a situation of stress. If you want to say, it's created basically, it's created an example. It gives us an example to study the system that's governed by a set of complex laws and policies under stress. And to examine this system under stress, I use the example of hydropower production, an important water use at the dams that hasn't quite been studied through research and policy efforts as much. In my research efforts, I'm guided by 2 overarching research questions. They are, how do water, environment, and energy laws and policies influence dam operations and hydropower generation in the Colorado River Basin? And what are the consequences of reduction or loss of hydropower generation in the Colorado River Basin? The intent of these questions is twofold. On the one hand, I want to understand how the prevailing framework of laws and policies affects hydropower generation. On the other hand, the challenge is to analyze what consequences the current legal framework creates and what consequences it produces for the different resource users in the basin if hydropower generation declines. Before I delve into the meat of the presentation, I want to give a quick overview of my research methods as well as conceptual tools. So I primarily use a comparative case study framework here, focusing on Hoover and Glen Canyon dams. I picked these 2 dams for 3 important reasons. They are the largest water storage reservoirs in the basin. They have the largest hydropower generation capacity, and they also lie in 2 distinct legal parts of the basin. That is, Hoover Dam lies in the lower Colorado part, and Glen Canyon Dam lies in the upper Colorado Basin. These 2 basins had water development occur at different points in time. Lower Basin developed first, and the upper basin developed later. And so picking these two dams that are strategically important by linking the two basins, they also show how laws and policies that have evolved with time affect the two dams differently. In terms of conceptual tools, I particularly study how institutions affect operations from the perspective of governance, which is a process of decision-making that is structured by institutional arrangements, that's laws, rules, and norms, and shaped by ideological preferences. Typically, in social sciences, when people refer to institutions, there's a tendency to think about organizations, such as universities, such as the Supreme Court, etc. But in this presentation and in my research generally, I use the idea of institutions that's put forth by institutional economists, particularly Commons as well as Elinor Ostrom. And for them, institutions are the rules that guide and restrain behavior, which is they're the working rules, and going concerns is essentially the process of transacting and interacting with other human beings. In the case of natural resource governance and management, institutions are very important because they determine who can control resources, how resources are allocated, who can participate in decision making, and what are the consequences of changes in decisions over resource use and allocation. Institutions can take a variety of forms. They can be formal laws, rules, property rights systems. They can also be informal customs or traditions. But in this dissertation, I primarily study the formal laws and policies because they undergird dam operations as well as power production. I also use Elinor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework to identify out of the plethora of laws which ones apply to dam operations. And I then use this framework to analyze particularly how laws affect operations and the differential consequences that the different laws produce for resource users in the basin. A quick outline for the remainder of the presentation. I will first go through the comparative analysis of water and environmental laws and talk about how they affect dam operations and power production. I'll then move into discussing the consequences of reduction in hydropower generation, first for power users and then for water projects and environmental programs. In the discussion of consequences, I'll weave in the necessary ideas as well as laws and policies that are important from the perspective of energy use and production. I'll then move into conclusions and lessons. Okay, jumping into the comparative institutional analysis. Water laws and policies are immensely important for the Colorado River Basin as they create the foundation on which the water itself is governed and managed. The water laws and policies primarily determine the priority of how water in the basin can be used, such as the different uses it can be used for. And they also create guidelines on how water can be released from the dams itself. In addition, water laws also link different resource uses together, such as hydropower and other water uses. In the discussion of water laws and policies, you'll notice that there are three separate columns here. What they represent is that the center column here, Hoover and Glen Canyon, represents laws and policies that apply to both Hoover and Glen Canyon dams. On the left, you'll notice that the laws and policies apply to Hoover alone, and on the right, these are laws and policies that only apply to Glen Canyon Dam. If you want to think about it in a way, the ones in the middle, they form the overarching framework for governing water in the river, and these two sets of laws that apply each to Hoover and Glen Canyon then determine how the dams themselves are also operated and governed. I will first focus on how water laws govern water releases. And in this discussion and throughout the presentation, when I'm talking about laws, you'll see them highlighted in bold, given that this research has primarily been like a large institutional analysis. There are a lot of laws to deal with, and this is my way of simplifying them. So when you think about releases, one of the fundamental laws is the Colorado River Compact that divided the waters of the Colorado River for use between the lower basin as well as the upper basin that we observed earlier. It allocated 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin, 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin. When the Mexican Treaty was passed, this was the first time that Mexico received an allocation of the Colorado River. That was 1.5 million acre feet. Taken together, these two laws create some of the foundations of water release requirements in the basin. And the reason the compact itself is particularly important, and it creates the first distinction on constraints for operating Glen Canyon Dam versus Hoover Dam, is that each year, Glen Canyon Dam has to release 8.23 million acre feet to satisfy the obligations of the compact to downstream lower basin states as well as Mexico. What that means is that even when there is a drought, even when there isn't enough water, the upper basin is still on the hook to deliver 8.23 million acre feet. And one of the consequences of this is that the impact, or rather the consequence of climate change, as well as the burden of bearing climate risks, lie with the upper basin states largely. Since the 70s, there have been a few other guidelines that have been passed, and I'll focus on the interim guidelines from 2007. These guidelines, this was the first time that the basin had been in a protracted drought, but there were no guidelines on how to operate Hoover and Glen Canyon in drought situation. And so they created a tiered system of water releases with the hope of sharing the burden of the drought. What that means in practice, and I'll show you in a minute, is that if you look at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the interim guidelines created different tiers of operating the two dams. The idea was to keep them at an equal level as much as possible. At each tier, water has to be released into Lake Mead, and it can range from as low as 7 million acre feet to as much as 9 million acre feet, depending on where Lake Mead is. Given its current elevation on September 3rd, and given Lake Mead's elevation on September 3rd, it's in the upper elevation balancing tier. Because Lake Mead is in a normal condition, or an ICS surplus condition, only 8.23 million acre feet has to be delivered. Had it been lower, more water had to be delivered. Had it been higher, less water would have had to be delivered. Okay, so given the elevation of Lake Powell and Mead, what we see is, because it's in the current elevation, 8.23 million acre feet will be delivered from Lake Powell into Lake Mead. Now, the reason the lake elevations are extremely important is because they affect hydropower generation. Hydropower generation is a product of two main things. Two things are essentially important. That is hydraulic head and flow. Water laws and policies predominantly affect hydraulic head because depending on where the water level is, they release water, and this can affect tremendous changes in elevations at the two dams. So one of the components of hydropower is hydraulic head, and that is impacted by water laws and policies. As a result of the drought that's ongoing in the basin, the two dams, like hydropower generation at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, actually reduced in capacity. And this is because as lake levels decline, the efficiency of hydropower turbines declines. And that's because there's airflow and that reduces efficiency. And so one of the big takeaways here is that water laws and policies have an effect on hydropower generation because it impacts lake elevations. Moving into water prioritization, as well as linking resources. So in this case, some of the oldest laws that govern water use in the western part of the United States is important, and that's the Reclamation Act of 1902. This act was pivotal in starting the era of building hydraulic projects in the western part of the United States beyond the 100th meridian, roughly. The idea of building irrigated infrastructure then was to support irrigated agriculture. And so the primary priority of water use from reservoirs was irrigated agriculture. When the Colorado River Compact was signed, that is when dam development began in the Colorado River Basin. The compact, beyond just like allocating the water between the two basins, also set priorities of how water could be used. Because it came after reclamation law, it used the same priorities. First, the water was to be used for irrigated agriculture, as well as domestic use. Second, for power production. Third, for navigation. So power production has a lower priority than irrigated agriculture. Boulder Canyon Project Act authorized the construction of Hoover Dam. This act as well maintained a lower priority of hydropower generation compared to irrigated agriculture and domestic uses. What was important when Boulder Canyon Project Act was passed is there was a growing recognition that the people for whom the projects were built to begin with, that is irrigators, did not have the ability to actually pay for the projects. And so when Hoover Dam was built, the largest share of costs were actually borne by electricity consumers. That's the hydropower consumers. After Hoover Dam was built, this idea that the irrigators lacked the ability to pay had become very, very pronounced. And so the Reclamation Project Act was passed in 1939 that essentially said that irrigators only had to pay the amount that they could given their ability at the time. That is to repay the cost of construction as well as operating the hydraulic facilities. In 1939 and 1940, this ability was deemed very low. And so Congress had to figure out a way to continue paying for these projects if the irrigators themselves could not. And the big pot of money that they went to was hydropower generation at these facilities. There was a big demand for power, and so there was this assumption that power would produce enough revenue to sustain these projects. This idea of hydropower supporting irrigation was crucial and fundamental to the Colorado River Storage Project Act, which authorized Glen Canyon Dam. But in the case of this law, as well as subsequent law in the Colorado Basin Project Act, hydropower revenues not only covered the individual projects, but in this case, the revenues were used to support a wider and larger number of irrigation projects in the Upper Basin. So in the case of the Upper Basin, the Storage Project Act authorized 4 hydropower facilities, but they were supporting not just those 4 facilities, but 16 other irrigation projects. The Basin Project Act, on the other hand, allowed the use of power revenues to some extent to fund one of Arizona's most important hydraulic infrastructure, that's the Central Arizona Project. And so around the time, that's like the 50s and 60s, politically, the irrigation projects were called self-financing. But this was just a political illusion because the projects were not in fact paying for themselves. They required large sums of hydropower revenues to keep them financially solvent. This was the birth of cash register. Mark Reisner uses this term in his famous book, Cadillac Desert on the Colorado River Basin. And so the idea was that hydropower would produce revenues that would essentially bankroll all these projects. It was the cash in the cash register. But if you think about it, this cash register funding model had some very serious assumptions. Those assumptions were that there would be no other competing water uses for hydropower production. That way, power production could be optimized, maximized to produce as much revenue as possible. Second assumption was that there'd be good hydrology forever. The third assumption was that hydropower would always be competitive and have a market. That is, there would be buyers who would buy this resource and produce enough revenue to sustain these projects. While the introduction to my talk gave you a sense that the good hydrology assumption may not always be true, I wanted to go through the other assumptions, that's competing uses and the market for hydropower. And we'll see that these assumptions are also deeply flawed. And to go through those assumptions, I'll begin with environmental laws and policies that create other constraints for hydropower production. When the two dams were built, that is in the 50s and 60s, you'll notice that there was very little consideration of environmental needs and uses in the authorizing legislations. In the Storage Project Act and the Basin Project Act, there was some talk of consideration of environmental uses, but it wasn't actually at the forefront of governing dams. But this began to change in the 70s when the National Environmental Policy Act was passed and the Endangered Species Act was passed. National Environmental Policy Act requires federal agencies to consider the impacts of their actions. This act is also important because if you think about the early stages of dam development, reclamation that operated these facilities, as well as water users, were primarily the people who were involved in decision making. But NEPA opened the process up to the public, who could then contest decisions taken by federal agencies. There was also the Endangered Species Act, which gave greater consideration to environmental water needs. In the West, ESA has proved to be very politically contentious as it overlays environmental water needs on a system of water that has already been allocated. And at times, like the Colorado River Basin, it has been over-allocated. And so, as a result of passage of these two laws and policies, there began this era of large-scale lawsuits against Bureau of Reclamation for not conducting impact assessments and not changing its dam operations or addressing environmental concerns. Reclamation, however, resisted making any changes to dam operations. But this began to change in the late 80s when, in the case of Glen Canyon Dam, it conducted environmental studies to justify increasing hydropower capacity. But these studies had an unintended effect. Instead of supporting the finding that they could just increase hydropower capacity, the finding instead was that the way that Glen Canyon Dam was managed was actually producing environmental impacts. And so there began a big public outcry over how Glen Canyon was managed. In the case of Hoover Dam, 3 species were listed as endangered, and majority of the lower basin, the part below Hoover Dam, was marked as critical habitat for several of these species. And so there was a growing recognition that if ESA lawsuits had to be prevented, then there had to be some way to address the ESA issues. The approaches used in the case of 2 dams to address the environmental crisis were very different. In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, a lot of the people who supported environmental needs and concerns sought to Congress to pass the Grand Canyon Protection Act that considered environmental needs and uses. As a result of the Protection Act, there was an EIS that was conducted, and there was also a change in dam operations. In the case of the Lower Basin Multi-Species Program, they created a habitat management program. Here are 2 quotes, or rather two ideas that summarize how the 2 programs differ. In case of Hoover Dam, the Lower Colorado Multi-Species Program does not actually change dam operations. It instead focuses on building habitat so that the species that are endangered will actually come and inhabit those areas. In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, on the other hand, the adaptive management program was implemented so that it could provide insights on how dam operations could in fact be changed. So if you think about the 2 programs and the consequences that they have for hydropower, they're very different. In the case of Hoover Dam, there are less impacts on hydropower generation because it does not actually change operations. In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, there has a significant impact on dam operations because of environmental restrictions on how water can be released from the dam on a daily basis as well as on a monthly basis. The two programs also have very different and distinct relationships with hydropower in terms of how power generation impacts them. When Hoover Dam was passed, politically, the program could only be passed if it was a federal and non-federal cost share. So this $623 million program is funded both by federal agencies and stakeholders, including water and power entities. So for power users in the lower basin, regardless of whether or not they receive hydropower, they still have to pay the cost of funding this program. In the upper basin, the situation is different. The program is funded largely by hydropower revenues. So its budget comes from a fund called the Upper Basin Fund, where essentially all the money in that Basin Fund cash register actually comes from hydropower revenues. Glen Canyon Dam, as well as Upper Basin programs, receive money from this Basin Fund that also provides money to repay the debt to Treasury, as well as provide funding for some other environmental programs in the Upper Basin. If you think about it, the combined effect of water and environmental laws is different for Hoover as well as Glen Canyon. If you look at Glen Canyon Dam, water and environmental laws affect both the hydraulic head daily flow, the two components important for hydropower generation. If you look at the trend of power generation at Glen Canyon Dam, you can see that after the EIS was passed and because of the drought, there has been a steady decline in an average decline in power production. On a daily level, because of the restrictions in how the water can be released from Glen Canyon Dam, the actual power production is also very constrained. And you'll notice why this is constrained if you compare it to Hoover Dam. So let's see Hoover Dam. If you look at Hoover, water and environmental laws largely affect hydraulic head. So water contractors require a certain amount of water to be released from Hoover Dam, and that's the only real constraint for power production. So once the water delivery schedule is planned for a given month, for example, the power generation can occur almost unrestricted on a daily basis. So if you notice, the visible spikes in power production correspond with times of the day when hydropower is most needed. So on a daily basis, Hoover Dam does not face as many impacts as Glen Canyon Dam. And this goes to show that even in the same river basin that faces the same biophysical constraints of drought, the actual effects are very different for two dams based on institutional constraints of water laws and policies. Now I'll use this as a segue to discuss consequences of changes in power generation and talk about how this delicate balance between hydropower revenues, power users, power generation, and power users basically is affected if there is a reduction in power generation. I'll begin with a discussion of the impacts for power users. And in this discussion, I'll weave in how energy laws and policies or particular power contracts come into play. The most obvious impact of reduction in power generation is that the power customers have to make up that generation elsewhere. So there is a financial impact, so to speak, because they have to get power elsewhere. But the actual impact faced by Hoover customers and Glen Canyon customers is very different. And this distinction is a result of how each set of customer uses this power, as well as the nature of the power contracts themselves. I'll first talk about the customers and the power uses. So 46 customers receive power from Hoover Dam. This includes municipal utilities, and it also includes an independently owned utility, that's Southern California Edison. In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, 130 customers receive power. Of these 130 customers, roughly 7 get 75% of the power, but these 7 customers then sell this power to multiple other utilities as well, to multiple other municipal utilities. And so you get a situation where in the case of Glen Canyon Dam, the large users, as well as majority of the other users, Hoover Power is a small part of their resource portfolio, In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, on the other hand, the power that they receive may be as much as 30 to 50% of their portfolio. The way that power users, Hoover power users, use this power, it's largely for peaking and ancillary services. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. In the case of Glen Canyon Dam, because of the restrictions in how water can be released, the users use it largely to shape whatever resource they have. So they use it, it's not quite peaking the same way as Hoover, but they use it in times of like the highest, like the peak load. And they can also use it for base load generation. And base load generation is typically used by customers that get 30 to say 50% of their power from these dams. So what does peaking and ancillary services mean? Peaking generation essentially is using generation or producing power when the demand for energy is highest. Hydropower is considered a good peaking resource because in times of highest demand, the cost of producing electricity can be very high. But because because hydropower's fuel is essentially free, water is free, the cost of generating electricity at peak hours is lower than, say, natural gas, which might need to also pay for fuel at that time. Now, ancillary services. Ancillary services are essentially services that are necessary to keep the grid from breaking down. So say if you have like a big generator go out and there's a big blackout, ancillary services include backstart capabilities, which is like if there's a blackout, you can use a resource to restart power. If there is variability in generation, particularly this is becoming a big problem with renewable energy penetration, hydropower has the ability to basically ramp up and down quickly to make up for the changes in variability. And this prevents the grid from going down as well. While natural gas can provide some ancillary services as well, every time you ramp up and down a natural gas unit, it produces more emissions compared to hydropower. And so generally, the big idea today is that hydropower can provide the strategic resource that's necessary to balance the variability produced by renewable energy. I'll use an example of the electricity supply in the California ISO market from this past weekend to show you this idea of peaking and ancillary services. If you look at coal and nuclear, they're flat. They're base load resources that are available throughout the day, and they don't change their production based on time of day. Hydropower, on the other hand, you can see that as the day progresses, as renewable generation increases, hydropower production goes down. But at the time of day when renewable declines, hydropower can quickly ramp up to make up that loss in generation. If you look at a generation stack, hydropower is usually the last resource that's deployed during peak demand hours. Now, Hoover can provide this peaking and ancillary services, and this is what the dam is mostly used for. Glen Canyon Dam, because of its constraints, cannot operate in a fashion that would allow customers to use the resource more dynamically. There is a big lesson that these charts provide for the strategic role that hydropower can play in supporting renewables. And that is, even in basins that may not have, say, a drought, like water availability may not be the only threat that would prevent hydropower from supporting renewables. Laws and policies, particularly water and environmental laws and policies, can also constrain how hydropower can or cannot support renewable integration. Okay, so moving into the contract itself, Hoover contracts are contingent. When you think of contingent contracts, what that means is if the generation of power declines, the actual obligation to deliver power from federal agencies also declines. Federal agencies are not on the hook to make up lost generation. This is not the case with Glen Canyon. In Glen Canyon, all the customers receive a fixed amount of allocation. What that means is if there is, say, a decline in generation, the federal agencies have to go out and make up the generation on their own. And so the contract type, as well as how the power is used and how the customers use power, produces different impact for Hoover and Glen Canyon. While it's known that any change or like any deficit, there will be deficit in generation that will need to be made up, the actual impacts for Hoover customers is lower because the dam currently has low head turbines that were recently installed so that power could be produced at lower lake elevations. These low head turbines cannot be installed at Glen Canyon Dam. So Hoover Dam is not as impacted by lower lake elevations, generation can continue. Glen Canyon Dam is more impacted because it doesn't have the same electrical infrastructure to make up, to have the efficiency to operate at lower lake elevations. The other thing is that because of the cumulative contract, customers already prepare ahead of time for, say, decline in generation. And because of declining natural gas prices and renewable energy prices, there are low-cost alternatives available to these customers, particularly in the West. In California, because of the glut of renewables, sometimes power is even sold for like throwaway prices. So for Hoover customers, there are alternatives available. And because the contracts are contingent, the federal agencies have not had to spend a lot of money to actually make up for lost generation. In Glen Canyon, the situation is different. The small customers in both cases will be more impacted, particularly those that have a high dependence. But Glen Canyon's small customers can't go out on their own and do what they please because they have transmission constraints. They do not own transmission, and they use federal transmission to actually use power. In Hoover, the customers use their own transmission. Now, the second point is that because of the firm contracts in Glen Canyon, if there is any reduction in power generation, it has to be made up basically by purchases on the spot market. And that can vary depending on whatever the cost of power is at the time. In the height of the drought in 2014, compared to Hoover's 11.5 million for throughout its lifetime, purchase power costs for Glen Canyon were $79 million for 2040 alone. Now the purchase power, the amount of money needed to purchase this power comes out of the Basin Fund. So if more money is needed to purchase power, the Basin Fund is depleted. If Basin Fund is depleted and not enough money can be sent to, say, the Treasury to repay irrigation infrastructure, then the rates have to be increased. But there's another big problem for Glen Canyon for not being able to increase rates, and that is the threat to its economic competitiveness. Over time, federal hydropower was relatively cheap, and it was priced lower than market rates. These are market rates at Palo Verde and in California, and you'll notice that there has been a sharp decline in costs. This is largely a result of declining natural gas prices as well as declining renewable energy prices. And so what you see is over time, Glen Canyon power costs have actually crossed the cost of obtaining the same amount of power, say in a market setting. Now, this is problematic. So increasing rates in this situation is problematic because customers who are economic actors might be motivated to go out and get power on their own, particularly the larger ones. This is bad news, not just for power customers, but for the projects like the irrigation projects and the basin itself. And that is because if cheaper power is available elsewhere, and if the rates are increased, then the customers will basically rescind their power contracts. If they rescind their power contracts, no money comes into the Basin Fund to then continue other programs. And this issue of increasing rates has already been problematic in other basins in the Western United States. And other federal agencies have been facing the challenge of retaining customers to pay for this resource. So this basically breaks the third assumption that we looked at. We know that the good hydrology was always false. environmental water uses are competing with hydropower production. So that assumption went out the window. And now with changing natural gas prices, rise in renewables, the competitiveness, the economic competitiveness of hydropower is also declining. And so there's a real threat to like generation of revenue if not enough money comes in. And so I decided to see what happens to water projects and environmental programs as a result. Because of the way that the laws are structured for Hoover and Glen Canyon, there are more economic impacts for the upper basin, that is where Glen Canyon is located, compared to Hoover Dam. In Hoover, only 20 million of debt to Treasury remains to be paid. In the upper basin, it's 1.8 billion. Only 2 aqueducts receive power from Hoover to pump water to, say, cities or irrigation. In the upper basin, it's 9 projects. And environmental programs are most threatened in the upper basin because they receive power from hydropower revenues. The multi-species program is sort of insulated until 2055 because of the cost share. And what I realized is that the basin is unprepared for not having a future without hydropower. In 2018, the Office of Budget and Management decided to basically rescind $23 million that are used for environmental programs from the Basin Fund and requested that $23 million to be sent directly to Treasury. This caused a lot of stress in the program as the Bureau of Reclamation had to scramble to find those funds and get a congressional appropriation. A lot of the stakeholders I talked to were really worried because this change came out of the blue. They were not prepared for it, and they were worried that if appropriations was the route in the future, it would be a fight to get money from Congress. So I decided to ask a couple resource users who would pay for this hydraulic system and environmental programs if there were no hydropower revenues. And the responses I got were that the farmers couldn't pay, the main project beneficiaries couldn't pay. A big issue with the farmers paying, the main project beneficiaries paying, is that water contracts are something like forever contract. Because they're in place forever, it's difficult to go midway and change them, particularly when you're going to go and say you're going to increase the price. It's not just politically going to be contentious, but it also involves a lot of legal costs to change the contracts. And the states that are the trustees of water resources, likewise, there was this idea that they wouldn't just step up and pay. So the question is, who would pay for that? And a big bottom line that came out of these discussions is that for power users, even though there may be there are alternative power sources available. So if hydropower generation declines, it may cost more, particularly it may impact small customers more and tribes more. There are some alternatives available. But in the case of water programs, of water projects and environmental programs, it's not extremely clear what these alternatives are going to be, and they may be more impacted into the future. And so this brings about the conclusion and lessons for the talk, and that is, even in the same basin, Hoover and Glen Canyon are located in the same basin, the way that water, environmental laws, and power contracts and energy laws come together, they create not only different constraints for hydropower generation, but they link hydropower revenues, water projects, environmental programs in different way. And because they link the resources in different ways, the consequences of reduction or loss in power generation are felt greater in the upper basin than in the lower basin. What this research has generally gone to show is that institutional design is extremely important, particularly if you want to adapt to a changing setting. So some of the lessons that we can learn if we want adaptive institutions is that they will need to balance long-term stability and flexibility. So for example, Hoover contracts are contingent. They will go down if there's no generation. But because Glen Canyon has fixed contracts, this increases the cost of having to adapt to a drought situation. There also needs to be periodic review and revision of arrangements. In the basin, in the Colorado River Basin, this inherent linkage of water, of hydropower, water projects, and environmental programs has not been revised, has not been taken, like the stakeholders involved in decision making have not revisited what do you do to like address the vulnerabilities, particularly for water projects as well as environmental programs. When you think about addressing vulnerabilities, one issue would be allocation of costs. And going forward, an important discussion would be how do you allocate the benefits and burdens? Hoover is insulated because of its cost share model, and perhaps something similar may be needed going forward for the Upper Basin. The last lesson is that there needs to be planning for contingencies and worst case scenarios. I was shocked to hear that even in the power sector, there was very little actual planning going on to deal with a situation when Glen Canyon Dam ceased to produce any power. Same for water projects and environmental programs if there are no revenues. And so as the institutions are revised, particularly the interim guidelines come 2026, a big discussion could be dealing with contingencies and worst case scenarios. And this concludes my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. I also want to acknowledge all the great people as well as that have supported my research, my interviewees who provided insights, my committee who provided great guidance and mentorship, and all these funders who provided support at different stages of my research. Thank you.